40K is a universe where the faster than light travel is explained by they take a shortcut through hell. It's the same explanation for fast travel as Minecraft.
Drawk show.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Drawk Show. Today, I'm going to be talking about Warhammer's The Warp with my friend Tristan. The show where I talk to somebody while drawing something relevant to the conversation, talking to people about their characters, their interests, their expertise. If you feel like you have something you want to talk about, feel free to come over to the Discord, pitch yourself in the I want to talk about, or pitch your character chats, and that's how I'm going to be finding people to talk to on stream. You get a free drawing out of it, so I think it's pretty worth it. Tristan, do you want to introduce yourself to the audience?
For sure. Yeah. My name is Tristan. I'm a university student and being an undergraduate in biology psychology. Have been interested in games and a lot of nerd culture for quite a long time. Specifically looking at like our conversation today with Warhammer. I have been mainly into fantasy for a longer period of time. Probably about 5 years now I've been interested in Warhammer Fantasy. And 40K was a little bit more hesitant towards getting into, but recently have come to like it more and more. It's grown on me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for at least a little while, because I got into Warhammer Fantasy because of you and the friend group that you introduced me to, and at first I really felt like, since I was introduced to Warhammer Fantasy first, and all I really knew about 40K was that it was the more popular one. I had a little bit of resentment that like Warhammer Fantasy had died for 40K being more popular, and that made it hard to want to get into 40K. But then once I started to learn a bit about the lore, I was like, oh, okay, I don't know if I like this as much, but it is also really, really good, and there's a reason that people like it so much.
Yeah, for me, I think the thing that made me most hesitant is like I liked fantasy's tone of grimdark, which was a little bit more. There were heroes, and these heroes had impact on a lot of the setting, and I felt that 40K didn't have that as much, and it was a little bit more of that embracing scene, like whole setting wide grimdark attitude where nothing really changed. It was constantly downhill. But I think that was a little bit of a misperception on my part, because I think that there are heroes, and these heroes do make large impacts. It's just whether or not the scale kind of gets a bit weird with how big the setting is.
It's a setting that is definitely, I think, more hopeless, and a lot of that comes from scale. But there are good people. But I think there is something to the darkness, though, because, like, whereas Warhammer Fantasy, in general, the heroes can just be heroic in Warhammer Fantasy, and there isn't a caveat. Whereas in 40K, heroes tend to either be a character who's forced to compromise on their virtues in some way, or a character who the tragedy is that they aren't going to be able to change things in the way they want to be. Like, there is more of an emphasis on the darkness of the world, whereas I feel like Warhammer Fantasy just it more feels like it happens to be dark than darkness is a necessity of the world, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think that like with Warhammer Fantasy, there isn't as much of a need to compromise with a lot of the people's morals, and like the power levels of individuals and the scale that they operate on allows them to kind of be, they can pursue their goals in ways that are pure. And even though there's tragedy, because a lot of good stories require that, or at least have the ups and downs, it doesn't nearly have like the tones that 40K has, where like you need to either compromise on your values to an extent, or you are just not as good of a person, I guess, just to put it plainly.
I think that's fair. So it's worth bringing up Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40K because the warp is very different in the two of them. Not incredibly, but just a lot of the finer rules and how it's perceived do change a lot. So we're going to be talking specifically about the warp of Warhammer 40K. I think, where do you start talking about the warp? I guess just it is a dimension alongside the dimension of reality, which is called real space, and it is effectively not a material dimension. It's a dimension shaped of thought and concept, where things don't concretely exist in the same way they do in the materium.
Yeah. I think that if you compare it, you draw analogies to it being like the Sea of Souls. This other personifications are like ideas that have floated around in mythology of the spirit realm, the realm that is mirrored from ours. Like all those sorts of things apply to it, and I always think of it as like this. It is like more of a sea. I think that inherently the warp is like not moving, but as soon as anyone interacts with it, the water moves. And so inherently it isn't necessarily chaotic as it often is portrayed in the setting. It is inherently quite stagnant, but then how everything influences it, because most things have a warp presence, their souls move the water, this and that, and so it ends up being this turbulent tide, this like constantly moving realm that causes a lot of problems for both the real space and how it influences real space, as well as the individuals who interact with it.
And any being who has a warp presence, their way of existing, how they perceive the universe, what they see is important, what they see the warp as, all shape the warp. It is the way that their soul's presence changes it based off of how they interact. And there's lots of examples of that. Like, I think the lore's undone a lot of the stuff of most of the Chaos Gods being human-made in different eras of humanity, because they realized with the scale of the universe that they were building to, that didn't make any sense.
Yeah, and there's enough things in the setting that are already human-centric that I think you can kind of make, you can make the Xeno species kind of more impactful on the setting as a whole if you make it that, like, you know, with the Slaanesh being distinctly.
Yeah, that one's distinctly Eldar.
Yeah, and I think that makes the setting more interesting and more like connected rather than just being a human-centric setting.
To have a bit more of that focus. So I think currently the idea is that Khorne, Tzeentch, and Nurgle, which you mentioned, those are the Chaos Gods, these entities. They are the most powerful conglomerates of concept that exist within the warp. They are the beings who there is the most warp energy dedicated to. They have more power than anything else, at least anything else that this galaxy can access, because the idea is there's only one warp. Because it doesn't have physical space, it is relative, like, it exists for this galaxy the same as it does for any other, but a being in another galaxy doesn't have the same Chaos Gods as concept, doesn't have the same ideas, so it could not access the warp as it is seen by beings in this galaxy who would share a more stable perception, or at least a more similar perception. It's kind of how I've heard that talked about.
Yeah, and the warp does somewhat map onto real space as well. If you look at like, this is how faster than light travel exists in the 40K setting, them moving into the warp to travel great distances.
Which is insane. Yeah, 40K is a universe where the faster than light travel is explained by they take a shortcut through hell. It's the same explanation for fast travel as Minecraft.
Yeah, I would agree, actually. So I was wondering if I wanted to make that comparison. Yeah, so to kind of dial back and look at more of the foundations of it, the most influential entities in the warp exist because of the emotions or general concepts that are the most prevalent. So that's why the four Chaos Gods embody, roughly speaking, Khorne with anger or rage, Slaanesh with the idea of excess, hedonic pleasure, those sorts of things, and Nurgle with... Nurgle's actually, I feel like, a weird one emotionally speaking. I think
emotionally, it's mostly apathy and acceptance, I think. Contentment.
Like yeah. And then Tzeentch with deception, ambition, any kind of general scheming, this scheming mollusk. So those being kind of the biggest things that are the big movers and shakers that actually impact people. You know, anger hurts people. It's, you know, you feel anger towards people who harm you. Also, fear often causes anger. If you're not really certain about something, one of the common ways of reacting to it is just anger towards it. But ambition is a common thing for anything that actually wants to be a mover and shaker in a setting or in a world in general society. Contentment is obviously very important is involved in happiness, And then Slaanesh, the pursuit of pleasure is a common thing for most organisms to be motivated. So, yeah, those are.
So they end up as the concepts that dominate the most of warp space. I have also heard an explanation that I like. I don't remember where it's from, but of the reason the immaterium seems to react to the material world in a way that tracks onto real space a little bit is just that the concept of two places that are physically closer together conceptually are closer together, both because people from one area are more likely to have experienced and talked to people from the other area, but also just if everybody who uses the warp for fast travel is aware that when you go between these two planets, it's further, that's going to have to be further in a world shaped by conception, because the conceptual distance is going to somewhat be mapped on to the actual distance, which I actually really like as an explanation, because I think that's one of the things where people have a lot of questions of like, well, if there is no space in the warp, how can things be different distances apart? And my favorite explanation for all the questions like that, like how is there time in the warp if time doesn't exist, that how is there space, etc., is that like you are bringing in a concept of time and space, so you interact with it as if there is time or space.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for you to completely abandon those thoughts that are so foundational to your existence. And time is always prevalent. Space is always prevalent. It's how do you imagine existence without those? Is hard for most organisms that exist.
Yeah, but almost impossible, I'd say. And whether or not you yourself can imagine it, like let's say your navigator, who are basically wild, specially bred psychic mutants who guide the Imperium of man's ships through hell. Even if your navigator is somehow able to bypass the concept of distance and be like, yeah, we're not that much further. I think there's only so much they could speed up the travel through the warp, because those planets conceptually are still the distance they are in concept to all of the other people who are aware of those two planets' existence. And the warp isn't... It isn't entirely one of those things where it's not like the creature from It, where if the four kids currently facing it think, well, it's not that dangerous, it's not that dangerous. Like, whether or not you believe in demons, there is a level of threat posed by a demon, because demons are generally believed to be dangerous.
Yeah, exactly. And it kind of ends up having this like snowball effect with any strong enough idea and emotion that it reflects onto the warp, it starts to be self-perpetuating. So even though you can try and deny it, it will endeavor to try and keep itself going. So there's like, I don't really know necessarily, it's not the most consistent thing with this part specifically, but with like a group of people be like, no, it doesn't exist at all. But then it kind of, there's a delay of sorts, there is a reaction from the entity trying to self-perpetuate. And it could be just because it's hard to truly believe something versus say something. That might be part of the reason.
I think that's part of it. And I think it's also like everybody's perception shapes it. Like there are certain worlds where people arrive and they have concepts that match the Chaos Gods pretty one-to-one, but their interactions with Chaos are fairly stable because the people of that world believe that no, this is a god of joy, this is a god of life, this is a god of knowledge, and this is a god of honor. And because they see the Chaos Gods as those, they're more likely to manifest in that way on their world. So, but that's a lot of people believing in it. So I feel like it's one of those things where you yourself having a belief is only going to do so much because, like, everybody around you also affects how it manifests.
Yeah, and you also do have the entities that are so powerful, like the greater demons, which end up being kind of big movers and shakers in the setting, and they can travel outside of the domain in which they are believed. We'll say like a Khorne demon being believed, generally speaking, throughout the galaxy as anger, destruction, blood, etc., killing, and then it travels to an area where they're like, no, like it's all about honor and about fair fighting and stuff, and then it could travel there, and it wouldn't necessarily just change, like because it's so powerful in the warp, it just is operating on its own rules. And, it has almost a mind of its own.
It is able to almost carry that other concept of it with it. Like, no, I am a crazy, blood-crazed monster. There's also just the fact that, like, demons are largely formed by Chaos Gods, like, giving a piece of their power. So you have, if this creature was created from Khorne and Khorne was going, yeah, I'm a bloodthirsty killer. This is a piece of me that's a bloodthirsty killer. That piece doesn't stop being a bloodthirsty killer just because people nearby believe it so. It's just like the people who directly interacted with Khorne and the concept they all had of it was a god of honor. A demon created from that part of Khorne might not be a bloodthirsty monster in the same way.
Yeah, exactly. One other thing that I find quite interesting about the warp is kind of the general Imperium of man's perspective on it. So like they kind of see it simultaneously as the Judeo-Christian hell and heaven. Like if they are good citizens, then the Emperor will protect them in the warp. They'll protect their souls. They'll have a good life. They'll be, their soul will be thrown into the Sea of Souls, but it'll be good. But then if you're a Chaos Worshipper, then you'll just be 100% devoured by the Chaos Gods or their demons. It simultaneously acts as both.
I hadn't really thought about that, how it fits both entities, but yeah, that's definitely how it's interpreted, and that's very fun how it manages to be a stand-in for both.
Yeah. And so it ends up being a Realm of the Dead, and you have certain times in the lore, like it is the lore and how the writing often is it tries to create more opportunities for interesting writing and like cool ideas while not restricting writers that much, unless it is something that is truly valuable. So you can have concrete things in the lore, because obviously there needs to be some concrete things. You can't have just everything be nonsensical and not understandable, or else it's not the most engaging setting. But they do keep things quite open for interpretation for fan theories, which I think generally Games Workshop is quite good at promoting fan theories.
Yeah. I mean, there are huge, huge gaps that are able to be filled in by the fans in most pieces of the lore, which is great. It's good for engagement. I think Warhammer 40k is one of the most fun universes to play with and talk about and, like, theorize about and create ideas for because of that. Whereas, like, as much as I like playing in Warhammer Fantasy a lot, like, in tabletop and the like, I don't play the wargame. Very expensive. Just if there knows if this channel takes off, and it's going to, maybe I'll start playing the wargame because I'm able to afford it. But until then, just tabletop gaming for me. But I love it as a player. But as far as like something to think about and talk about and theorize, Warhammer 40k is so fun.
Mm-hmm. It has so much more big picture things.
It's just, it feels massive.
Yeah, and even like when looking at like Fantasy's warp equivalent, like there's a lot more. There's like I think simultaneously there is more concrete things and less concrete things. Like it ends up being, it's more concrete in the sense of, how do I describe it? Like there are mentions of Mor's Garden, the god of death, and like this.
Yeah, specific places. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, like it's less concrete because it's not said that the good gods actually operate within the warp, which is or in the material however you want to describe it.
Yeah, because there are real, actual, full-on gods like that are similar to the Chaos Gods as they are actually believed in gods in Warhammer Fantasy, but it's not like it isn't made clear at all if they are warp entities or if they are something else. And I think I've seen conflicting stuff about which people believe them to be, whereas Warhammer 40k is very much like, no, if something exists as a god, it exists in the warp. That's where non-material things are from and exist, and there isn't an alternative.
Yeah, one actually thing that I find quite interesting is the theory on the Emperor as a god. Like, there's a couple, like some of it's old writing, some of it's new writing, but the Star Child, which is kind of the reference of the Emperor in warp space, like potentially his soul, potentially just an entirely new entity, I find quite interesting. Do you know much about the Star Child?
I know nothing about the Star Child.
So, as far as I know, and this is a little bit limited, but the Star Child is referred to as such because it's this entity that has been interacted with by certain individuals in the lore, and it is the Emperor as a god in warp space. And so, some of the theories, the one that I personally like the most, is that it's a piece of the Emperor's soul that he broke off intentionally.
Okay.
It's almost like a fallback plan for him because he had apparently was, thinking so far ahead, with his future sight back in the day when he was operating. And so his fallback plan of him being worshipped as a god, and so that his intentions and his ideas, his soul, would still be able to help the Imperium going forward. And then so the Star Child is the god that gives power to certain individuals in the setting, like Sisters of Battle. How would you describe Sisters of Battle?
Oh god, power armor gun nuns is the easiest way.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's certain times where they get divine intervention and helping them, and so theoretically that would be the Star Child influencing them in good ways. So that's one of the theories. Other theories are just that everyone worships him, therefore his presence has now manifested.
Yeah, enough belief is manifest. I mean, there's in Warhammer 40k, there's trillions and trillions of humans, so all of them believing in this singular god entity is. I mean, each of them has a warp impact. People's belief in violence makes Khorne powerful. People's belief in excess makes Slaanesh powerful. So it makes perfect sense that all of that belief from humanity that there is a powerful god emperor creating a god, whether or not it's a piece of his soul, I think it makes perfect sense in lore that would just exist. And at that point, it would be this question of, is that the emperor at all? Would the Star Child then even slightly be the Emperor in that world if it's just formed of people's belief in the Emperor?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, the question really is in the current lore is, while the Emperor is pretty much incapacitated entirely, is he somewhat intentionally, consciously, however you want to describe it, influencing the galaxy through the Star Child, through this piece of his soul theoretically that he has broken off? Does he have autonomy here, or is he totally incapacitated and this entirely grimdark perspective of he's just barely holding on and is the beacon of light for people?
Well, I think you could create this interesting almost middle ground where it's oh no, he is incapacitated. The Emperor is basically dead. He's a skeleton in a chair, but his soul lives on through the bone marrow. And then the Star Child exists and is not him. That's just a reflection of people's worship. And it is the God Emperor of mankind, but it's not the exact man, because it's just... Because if he's not a god, this could be an entity made by worship that is a god.
Mm-hmm. And you end up having this somewhat... this issue, speaking for, good gods, in kind of quotation marks, for in the 40k setting, where the more complex the idea of a god is, the harder it is to perpetuate, because everyone's going to have slightly different interpretations of a complex idea. Mm-hmm. Looking at simple ideas like Khorne, Slaanesh, and etc., and those ones, they are simple, distilled emotions, which can have complex, add-ons, but in their foundation, they are these simple ideas. And so the Emperor as a god is such a complex idea. He is a protector of man and maybe at his roots, but what does that mean? Mm-hmm. Protect what? And so no matter what, he's going to be a little bit less influential in the warp, and therefore in real space.
Well, that's... No, you go.
Oh, and so just because he's less influential, that actually has further problems in the setting as what are the good guys, and also in the warp, what ends up happening with any idea, any god that is created, it ends up distilling the idea that it is formed of. And what that means is it embodies it in every aspect. Generally speaking, it'll embody all the parts that you want and all the parts that you may not want as well.
Right. Because all of that is conglomerated into this singular entity.
Mm-hmm.
So Eldar, who are space elves and have powerful souls, they who see the Emperor as a destructive warmonger, are adding that themselves, whether or not they worship the God Emperor, to what his warp presence would be.
Mm-hmm. And because they often are self-perpetuating, you'll have situations like, a hypothetical god of mercy will be extremely merciful. Everyone believes in the virtues of mercy and how that is a good thing at times. But if this entity then exists, it embodies virtue in every context. If someone may do something unforgivable, that god will influence real space by making you mercy and a healing idea in some way. Maybe it'll influence an actor or cause your soul to be moved one way or the other. So the issue is any good thing can often become a bad thing, because it's hard to argue any single idea is good, because it can be twisted.
So one thing that I want to talk about, if we're talking about warp entities made, I love the Tau. The Tau are, for the uninitiated, a non-warp capable race. They have no connection to the warp, or almost no connection to the warp as they are. They're a new race. They've become technologically powerful incredibly quickly, and they have a belief called the greater good, which is that if all the intelligent beings who are capable of cooperation were to cooperate and work under the Tau banner, that would be the best way for reality to progress. And because of that, they've tried to, where possible, because humans can be reasoned with, they've tried to, instead of killing humans, bring them into the fold as part of the Tau Empire. And the thing that they weren't ready for is they have so many humans in their empire, and they have warp presence, and they have been taught to believe in the greater good, and many of them have started worshipping the greater good as a religious concept, because humans are innately religious. We like to look for a mythology behind things, and for things to have explanation and reason and sense to them. And the cool thing that I really like about this conceptually is it's led to a god being created of the greater good. And I think what you were saying about complex things becoming having a harder time becoming a warp entity, I think the greater good is boiled down as such a simplistic concept. Like, it's taught to the Tau as a simple as kind of thing. You know, you cooperate, that's good, that's it. Cooperate is good, and it's good because it's good. That it has, despite the fact that there's far fewer humans in the Tau Empire than there is in the Imperium of Man, they've created a minor deity already, because greater good is such an easy concept to conceptualize and worship.
Yeah, it really is. Like, we all work together. The leaders will do great. It'll all work out for us. Prosperity, nice.
Nice. Because it's such a simple and easy concept to go behind, it's already becoming a warp god. And the Tau don't like it, because they don't want there to be a weird, bizarre hell religion being made of their philosophy.
I mean, yeah, it's completely out of their hands, too. Like, especially the leadership cast of them, the Ethereals, they are so used to having such great control, and then this warp entity based on their idea suddenly manifesting, which they don't have any experience or knowledge of how to actually handle this.
Physiologically, they have no connection to the warp. They don't have a method of dealing with this.
Yeah. The Ethereals are the only group within the Tau that have the most minor of souls, theoretically. It's a little bit of a spotty thing as to what degree, but...
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just such a scary concept for them, and it's so dangerous, so they're pretty against it, which, fair enough.
I mean, yeah, it is, sure, it's their concept, but it has become entirely outside of their control, and they're like, this is what we wanted to happen, guys.
It's spooky, it's kind of, where's it gonna go?
What's it doing?
Yeah, especially considering how they see the warp as, like, a science, like, they don't see it religiously like pretty much everyone else does.
Yeah.
That it's like, yeah, you psychers with your mind science.
They're using their brain science that we haven't figured out yet.
Yeah, we'll get there eventually.
We'll get there. Yeah. We'll figure out the brain science. You're not smarter than us. But to everybody else, it varies from, like, no, this is psychic powers, to, no, this is magic.
Yeah, especially looking at the space elves, the Eldar, they really are just magic to the max.
Yeah. No, this ain't brain science. This is magic that I'll leave it to elves. Elves are going to think everything's magic.
Exactly. They engage in a lot of magitech aesthetic and such, and everything in their society is magic, and it sometimes gets a little bullshit, but, mostly in 40k, you have to handwave the hypertech.
They have soldiers who are ghosts piloting robots. I think they can call things magic if they want.
That's so true. Yeah. The warp is pretty interesting. It is inherently a chaotic thing. So going into the warp, you have the issues of going mad because your mind can't handle just the vast expanse of this reality that you are not used to. That it operates so fundamentally different from yours. And then there's also the issue of demons, these warp entities that, generally speaking, are malicious because they are self-perpetuating, and so they'll try to... You're just a source of food for them.
And as people have thought of them as more and more malicious, they will become more and more malicious because that's more of the concept they're being given.
Exactly.
So it's one of those
There's
interesting things where, like, before demons existed, they wouldn't, like, before demons were powerful enough to manifest in reality, they wouldn't have been as dangerous and bad because they were more based off concepts. They were based off the concepts of combat and anger, the concepts of ambition. And those concepts, while they can be dangerous in excesses, aren't inherently evil. But then once they started being able to interact with the Materium, they would have become genuinely malicious and evil because bit by bit people would see them and go, well, that did a bad thing. It's a bad thing. And then the next ones get worse and they're like, well, that was a very bad thing. And then it's a very bad thing.
Yeah, and you also have the issues of just, most entities like being fearful of the unknown. And so as soon as you have fear, you have fear of it being dangerous. And if you have that, then bada bing, bada boom, it's a dangerous entity.
As simple as.
Yeah, exactly. One thing that's kind of interesting is the manifestations of gods that are not the chaos gods. I actually do quite like as much as they can kind of come across as Mr. and Mrs. MC in lore, the God Emperor's influence is pretty cool with how he manifests his demons, arguably, or however you want to call them.
Yeah, his super angels.
Exactly. There's a couple examples of them too. You have what the hell? There's a couple of Sisters of Battle who namely got basically resurrected, and whether or not they're entirely themselves afterwards, or if they're effectively demon host.
It'd be hard to be entirely yourself if you are brought back from the dead as a super angel by your god. I feel like it's excusable that maybe your view on the world has changed a bit in between death and becoming an angel.
Yeah, I can't see. There's one interesting Space Marine chapter too. I think it's the Legion of the Damned. Is this the one?
It sounds like people who would have an interest in hell.
Yeah, so Legion of the Damned. Do you know anything about them?
No, I do not.
So their origins are a bit questionable, but there are some plenty of theories about them. But effectively, what they are a mysterious band of Space Marines.
Okay.
Which pop out of the warp and just save things and save people.
Okay.
They're thought to be effectively demons because they live in the warp almost certainly. And they are thought to potentially have been a lost loyalist chapter called the Firehawks.
Okay.
Which ended up being kind of caught in the warp and being potentially consumed by the warp.
Okay.
Whether or not that's actually the reality, I mean, there's a lot of fan theories, and it's quite up in the air. But they're a really cool example of what could be called demons being a positive impact on reality, because Space Marines are these are perceived by the average person as angels. They are called the Emperor's angels. And so them coming in and saving the day is pretty much what's expected.
Yeah. Oh, so you're saying it's... Oh, okay. So the debate is, instead of a lost Space Marine chapter, they could be demons who've manifested of people's worshipping concept of Space Marines as saviors. So they are... Oh, that's so I love that. That's really good.
Yeah, it's cool. And so there is a middle ground as well. It could be both. It could be that originally there was these souls that were caught in the warp, and then they kind of, through lots of willpower, ended up keep holding on to at least their souls, their bodies being torn apart by the warp itself, and then coming in and being these warp entities that save people. And then eventually, as they appear coming from the warp, people are like, oh my god, that's like an angel, a true angel of the warp.
A middle ground that I could see being kind of interesting is that if you spend too long in the warp, you're in a place of concept. Don't you at some point become the idea of yourself and what you are thought to be?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And then that's probably what could happen. And then because people now have this concept of these angels in the Materium, these the Emperor's angels, more of them will come about.
Yeah.
So,
that's rad. I really like that as an idea, that like they're demons in the shape of Space Marines, even if they were once Space Marines, but because the concept of them is that they should be coming in to save people, that's what they do, is they show up out of nowhere and save people. That's awesome.
They have a very, very funny aesthetic where like they're all black for the most part, but they have like Guy Fieri flames on their like shins and shoulder pad. Very funny aesthetic.
Yeah, that's a style choice to make.
Yeah. Yeah, they're pretty cool. They actually are involved in the tabletop role-playing game Deathwatch. Actually has an option for when you, as a Space Marine, die, you kind of come back and save the day briefly as one of them.
Oh, that's so fun. Deathwatch is such a cool game. I don't want to get into it too much here, but I just want to say for everybody out there, if you're a tabletop gamer and you've only really played D&D, because that's kind of what everybody plays these days, consider picking up a Warhammer 40k game if you like what we're talking about. Deathwatch is such a fun one. It's a great time.
Yeah, they all have very different vibes and different scales for the different 40k games. You have like anything from average guy in Dark Heresy to the Space Marines, Emperor's Angels with Deathwatch.
Yep.
So they're very fun. Yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about the warp or anything that's really interesting to you?
Oh boy. I think.
I guess you could talk about it. Go ahead.
The creation of Slaanesh is one that I find bizarre and interesting because it brings up the idea of time in the warp. So to go into the creation of Slaanesh at first, as I understand it, the basics are that there were the Eldar. They were fighting Egyptian zombie robots. Egyptian zombie robots lost the war. Or were going to lose, and they went, fuck this, what we're going to do is we're going to go for ultimate nap. We're going to synchronize our alarm clocks, we'll wake up at the same time, and we're going to give it enough time that the Eldar should have burned themselves out, and then we can just conquer a weakened infant galaxy without the Eldar opposing us. Then the Eldar were like, sick, that's awesome, did a party time about it, got way into debauchery, and everybody was like, hey, this is about to go bad, and they were like, fuck you, you're not my dad, you can't tell me what to do. So then the commitment to excess and debauchery became so grotesque and over the top that the powerful souls of the Eldar formed the fourth chaos god Slaanesh, which awoke and killed the Eldar gods save for one, blew up most of their planets, and has kind of determined where they are now. And where I kind of want to talk about that, and where I want to see your opinion is, how the other Chaos Gods have this idea that, yes, this is the point Slaanesh was created, but also Slaanesh has always existed.
It's... Yeah, I guess if you're looking into the warp, you could say that because everyone has this concept of time being a forward-moving thing, time is constant and flows, you can't go backward necessarily. But that's such a concept that's tied to the real space and not necessarily the warp. It's just whenever humans or other entities interact with the warp, their relative and perception, relative space and perception of their area kind of is bound to time. But then outside of that, it may not be. And so in that way, Slaanesh has existed forever, but is born at one point.
That's why I like the idea of you can only access the concept of the warp that you have access to conceptually. That's why I like that idea, because, sure, Slaanesh has always existed, because it would at one point exist, and there's no time in the warp, but the point of its birth is the point where there was a concept of it so significant that it can be accessed in the Materium instead of just in the warp.
Yeah, and you could look at it like there was always this hedonic pleasure, or just the pleasure-seeking excess and the want for more has always been a thing that has existed in pretty much every species, but this actual self-actualization that Slaanesh goes through of finally coming into an identity was this point in time, but time is relative and they can kind of go backward and forward within limits of the setting. But
that could also make sense. It could just be that Slaanesh existed, but because the Eldari have their own gods, they didn't seek out the idea of these chaos gods. They can interact with their gods. The way I've derisively described elf gods is that they are stories put inside a robot.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of what they are, is a concept of an Eldar myth that's been given a physical body to inhabit. But then, because of that, they could not be out looking for the Chaos Gods, creating this bridge between accidentally formed warp concepts that aren't carefully curated myths that they have been watching over. And then, at one point, Slaanesh just becomes, as a concept, this being of excess becomes too powerful, and is able to form a bridge into reality, because the warp becomes as aggressive as it does, as dangerous as it does in the birth of Slaanesh, because it rips open a hole between the materium and immaterium. So it could just be, yeah, Slaanesh was always around, but this was the point where Slaanesh briefly became so fucking powerful that there was a singularity ripping a hole from the immaterium to the materium.
Mm-hmm. And then you have like the consequences that they have with the different Eldar. Basically, when they die, they kind of get consumed by Slaanesh and the warp, unless, well, the two different groups have their own way of solutions, if you want to call them solutions per se.
Well, yeah, neither's really a solution.
Measures.
Yeah, you have one group who's like, well, anytime we indulge in any excess, Slaanesh angry. So if we live lives of control and don't give in to passions and use your discipline to force yourself to follow a path of perfection, where you commit yourself to one thing at a time and explore everything it has to offer with dedication, that type of commitment and focus will not give in to excess, and then Slaanesh can't grab her, put you in a sippy cup and drink your soul up, which, works, but problem being that just telling people Slaanesh is scary isn't usually enough, so younger Eldar are often like, shut the fuck up, you're not my real dad, I'm not going to get eaten by a demon lady, and then they do, because,
Truly a Pikachu face moment.
It's very hard to tell someone, no, if you don't do this really stupid amount of seeking perfection and avoiding excess, you're going to get eaten by a demon. No, for real. Like, it's really hard to get an Eldar who didn't live through it to understand how serious that is.
Mm-hmm. They also have the other stopgap measure of when they die, they put their soul in a cube, in a box.
Yeah, because even with their perfection, that just stops their soul from being eaten while they're alive. So they need special box, so that when you die, you go in the special box, and then box gets uploaded like a USB drive into the Ghostbusters spirit containment zone.
It's very funny to describe the Eldar things in derisive ways, because it's all dumb as rocks to think about.
Look, they put your soul in a USB drive and they upload it to the Ghostbusters ghost jail.
You're not wrong. That's just it.
That's what they do. It's how they stop your soul from being eaten by Slaanesh. Look at this. You don't want this woman eating your soul. That's not going to go well. Look at her.
I don't know. Some people might have other opinions, unfortunately. Yeah, and then you have the other group, which is just like complete opposite.
Yeah, well, because the entire idea is your soul, your excesses, your pain is a cup that Slaanesh drinks from. So one of them have the idea of, well, we won't indulge in that, so the cup never has anything to sip of, so that as we live, our soul isn't eaten. And then the other group goes, what if we just keep filling the cup back up?
Simple as. So they live off of torturing others, and only through expressing violence and torture and debauchery and depravity. And, at first they were doing it for fun, and now they're, trudging their way through horrific abuses and debauchery. I don't even like this anymore, but if I don't do it, my soul gets drunk. I don't want to get sipped, man.
I don't want the bad sip. So it's this weird situation of, they're the most over-the-top, edgy, grimdark thing to exist, but at a point you almost feel bad for them, because it's some of them sometimes are man, I'm kind of bored of torturing people all the time. This is so much effort to go through not to die, but I will wither and fall apart if I don't keep torturing people in more and more unique ways. It's genuinely hard to come up with new ways to do it at a point.
You live long enough and you just it's got a SOL.
Yeah, so they're the worst thing in 40k, but also, if they don't do it, they die. All because a long time ago they decided, instead of to live the life of really boring discipline, to say, no, fuck you, what if I torture people about it instead?
Yeah. The unfortunate thing too is really if you look at the Eldar in like a larger setting scale and look at their influence on the setting, overall, the Dark Eldar especially, and to an extent the Craft World Eldar, which is the ones we refer to that put the soul in the USB, they're not actually that big of players. Like they're just
not anymore, no.
Group. Yeah.
Like I feel like the Dark Eldar have more potential because they have so many more people to get things done.
Yeah.
Because Eldar have these very inconsistent birthing cycles because their whole point was they could reincarnate. So their makers, the old ones, didn't need to, specifically so that they could control their numbers more, made them reproduce very, very slowly because, well, your numbers are only going to go up still unless there's a mass death where there isn't warp space available for you to reincarnate from. So realistically, your births are only going to cover incidents of mass death where the warp tax would be too much for all of you to reincarnate. That's all it's going to do, so it's going to be very slow. Well, what happens if this lady over here is drinking your soul like a sippy cup when you die? You're not reincarnating, because she gives you the sip. So they don't have a lot of people, but then the Dark Eldar are like, well, okay, that's fine. We're just gonna artificially make people with our little honeycombs, and that's how we're gonna make up for population losses. And the strategy, it works, but their entire society has to be existed to capturing people to torment, otherwise their civilization falls apart. So while they have the numbers, they are too busy constantly torturing people to survive, and also throwing chunks of their city to a bunch of demons so that they don't get their city eaten. That's a separate thing. So they can't get anything done.
Yeah, they're kind of treadmilling.
Yeah, they have an incredible amount of manpower, but also they're a bunch of like loose coalitions and corporations. So like, there's also just no cooperation at all. They go on loose raids that are done for clout and profit. So, like, the Craft Worlders have the will and the drive to get things done, but lack the numbers. And the Drukhari, the Dark Eldar, totally have the numbers to get things done, but then, like, can't?
Yeah, they can, especially, like, because of the necessity for them to cause such terrible things across the galaxy, they end up just making no friends.
Yeah,
like,
no one's gonna work with them!
Make friends. Yeah. Unless you're, like, maybe, like, an outcast, like someone who, like a slaver. Like, a slaver's cat, of course. But...
And, like, they can deal with rogue traders sometimes, but, you know, most rogue traders aren't corrupt enough to do it.
Or, you know, risky enough.
Or brave enough, true. And, sometimes there's a group of Eldar who, from all the groups, who work together with the goal of eventually destroying Slaanesh, and they might work with you, but, like, very cautiously, and many, especially of the powerful Drukhari who actually have the resources that they could help with that, don't want to, because they're so rich that they're not the ones who are gonna run out of people to torture, and they're not the ones who are going to be thrown into the demon incursions. They're doing just fine, and they worry that attacking Slaanesh will just light a beacon and bring Slaanesh to their front doorstep. So the Drukhari, as much as they hate Slaanesh, aren't willing to actually fully join the fight against her, because it's like, well, you know, kind of going all right for me, the ones with any power.
Mm-hmm.
It's like how suspiciously the people who live in really stable climates aren't as scared of climate change.
That is true. This is a fair comparison. Another thing we can kind of talk about, which is a little bit quite related here, is the webway. The webway. In the Immaterium.
Yeah. So it's a piece of the Immaterium that isn't quite warp, but isn't, like... It's not Materium, it's not warp, it's webway.
It's webway. It's like a partition part of the Immaterium that they've kind of enforced reality on.
Yeah. It's interesting, and it's like... it was made by the old ones as a nexus between the Immaterium and Materium as a way for the Eldar to effectively have fast travel that didn't rely on blasting yourself through hell like humans do. And it's
built different.
It's faster, it's more precise, it's stable. You don't need a weird class of specially bred mutants to guide you through it. But it has a big issue, which is the old ones didn't teach anybody how to build web gates or what are they called? Warp gates? What are they called? What are the gates called?
I
think it's warp gates.
I think they're called warp gates. Yeah. Well, or just webway gates. Yeah.
Yeah. So like, sometimes they just get blown the fuck up. Like if humans find one of these, they'll just destroy it.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're not that hard to break. Like they take a lot of firepower, but they're breakable. So they are just actually running out of these things. But yeah, it's what's super cool is two of the groups of Eldar, the Harlequins and the Drukhari, live inside of the webway, and instead of just using it for fast travel, they actually have for the Harlequins, who are the ones who are so. This is a fun thing about 40k is Warhammer Fantasy had a very typical collection of three types of elves. You got your high elves, your evil elves, your forest elves, right? Which are called the high elves, the dark elves, the wood elves. Simple, basic fantasy. It's the choice we all make. And then you go into 40k and they're like, well, we're going to port these over. Right. Well, we got the high elves, which are the disciplined guys who live on ships. Understood. We have the dark elves. They live in the webway in a big debaucherous city. Cool. And you got clown elves. And the clown elves live in a ship in the webway, and they're committed to fighting Slaanesh.
Yeah, they also are the operators, or like the controllers of the Dark Library. Which
Yes.
is a very important thing in lore. The Harlequins are, yeah, why I brought up the webway in general as well is to bring up Harlequins. Because while I'm a little bit spotty on them, I think they're an extremely interesting and influential group in the lore.
Yeah, so I don't know a lot about the Harlequins and the library. I know the basics, so if you want to go into lecture mode.
Yeah, I'll see what I can do as best I can here. So the Harlequins are a group of elves that are Eldari, that are
Just space elves, whatever.
space elves that are quite mysterious to pretty much everyone. There are a couple individuals in lore. Gilliman, the leader of the Imperium now, the robe booty Gilly man, who does actually know, who knows a decent amount more, but they are the protectors of the Dark Library, which theoretically contains pretty much all knowledge that has been gained throughout the galaxy. Mm-hmm. It has everything, and it's actually kind of the fun part where all the books written for 40k are from the Dark Library. So it's kind of this like somewhat meta thing here. So the Harlequins are the guardians of the Dark Library, and they are the ones who protect all knowledge and are theoretically. They have a plan. They believe in the Laughing God, who is kind of the trickster god, and he has a plan for the galaxy. Mm-hmm. And so the Harlequins are just kind of enacting that plan. So I guess in some ways they're kind of a mixture of the Wood Elves and the Lizardmen from fantasy.
A little bit.
Yeah. They're fighting Slaanesh. They have a hilarious aesthetic where they're long and lanky space elves who have
they dress like weird, sexy, cyberpunk clowns and jesters and harlequins.
Yeah, totally. It's a pretty fun aesthetic, all in
all. It's a bizarre aesthetic. It very much feels like if a hot cosplay girl on Instagram announced that she was going to be like a sci-fi clown. First of all, why? Second of all, she would dress like a harlequin.
Yeah, you're not wrong. So yeah, they kind of operate in the webway. They have potentially supernatural powers that most people don't get, and many other Eldari just don't know why they have it, but they believe that they know like all the secret paths throughout the webway. They're kind of this. They're the fun archetype in myth or in fiction that fills this like. The trickster god that knows everything but won't tell because it's funnier this way.
Mm-hmm. And that's very much the vibe where they can just do stuff, no one knows why, and they're like, trust us, we're on a path to kill God, and then they do some shit that no one can explain.
And it could be for big funnies, it could be for actually killing God.
Yeah. You don't know, but they've said it's for killing a god.
Mm-hmm. And so they're very influential in lore. Like there's been a lot of interaction between them and Gilliman returning to the setting.
Yeah, they genuinely seem like the group of Eldari, despite being least populous, that does the most.
Yeah, no one really knows exactly. I think there's not really well known as to how they survived the original fall of the Eldari.
I think they were their city ship. I think was with the Black Library was in the webway when it happened.
I think so, yeah. And how they escape, like the Slaanesh sipping their souls.
That I don't actually know. Maybe, I mean, I've heard people say that their trickster god protects them, but I don't know if that's a real thing.
Yeah. I think they believe that just the laughing god escaped into the webway before it got slaughtered, and
he kept them safe.
Yeah. And
if that's true, all the other elves are dumb for not taking part in their plan.
Yeah, honestly, I guess they're just like, no. Look at them. How can they? How
could they be right? They're dressed like clowns.
Exactly.
You expect me to believe that they know what they're doing?
Yeah. And so it's interesting. The Black Library is spoken of as if it is a craft world, which like it might be, but it's a bit different. And
of course, it's a bit different. It's owned by clowns.
Exactly. I think there's a couple pretty unique characters that are in there. I think it's thought that one of the Primarchs might actually be in there.
Really?
Yeah, I think he's like completely incapacitated for the most part, but I think he's in there, hanging out unconscious or something. I would have to ask someone who's a bit more knowledgeable.
Hanging out downtown by myself in a craft world.
Yeah, just hanging out in the webway.
He's just doing him.
So Harlequins, very cool group. A group that I want to actually look into more because I find them very, very fun.
They're super neat. They're a group that I know very, very little about. I said this when I was talking to Sean before, that like I have been looking into 40k lore enough that if it were most franchises at this point, I'd feel like an expert, and instead I know very, very little.
It's just such an expansive setting.
It's so shockingly big. Because, like, genuinely, the amount of work I've put in, if I were learning, like, at this point, at this much work put in, I knew, like, most of the basic lore, like, most of the things that would ever come up in Pathfinder lore. Now, granted, Pathfinder lore is a bit harder to research, I'd say, also, because it's not as big. There's not, like, lore videos about it. But I put so much time into learning about 40k, and I feel like I know, you know, the basics pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a...
And it's pretty wild.
Such a big, fun setting.
Yeah, and I think it's actually kind of cool. Like, you and I have been playing quite a lot more of the tabletop games with 40k recently, and like they have fallen a little bit out of popularity, and like they stopped being supported. Like they're almost coming back again with more tabletop role playing games again with what is it called? I have there's a new one that's being made by Cubicle 7, which is very similar to Dark Heresy, and it's, you know, being kind of like the ground troops for important people, and it's like kind of sleuthing and very investigative, which sounds really
cool. Okay, so working as an inquisitor for an inquisitor almost.
Potentially, that's actually one of the options. One of the big mechanics of the game is you have like a patron, and that patron can be a variety of groups.
Oh, that's pretty neat. I think I like that. I'm torn. Okay, so I like that a bit less than my ideal, because my ideal would be going back to how it was, where there is a game for all of these different things. Like there's a game for a rogue trader, there's a game for working for the Inquisitors, etc., etc. So that they can each be very honed in. But if you wanted to make a 40k game that was more flexible and could run lots of stories, I think that's a really smart way to do it.
Yeah, I think that Cubicle 7, when it comes to the 40k setting, has chosen to go a bit more broad because of how expansive the setting is. So the other one that I just wanted to remember was Wrath and Glory.
Hello.
Welcome, Sean.
It's Sean. Sean is here, and he's going to join us. We're talking about 40k tabletop games right now. We've been discussing the nature of the warp.
Nice. I just dropped in.
Yeah, for sure. Just to finish my quick thought on this, Wrath and Glory has a very wide kind of it's a shotgun blast on the setting. Like you can pick up anything from kind of low power to high power groups, from like orcs, like any kind of Xenos, to Imperium, be a guardsman, be a space marine. Like it's very
okay. But you can play as Xenos.
Yeah, you can be like a group of orcs, and
I'm excited. Okay, I'm actually very excited for that, because I I love the Imperium of Man conceptually, but I really dislike how everything outside of the core war game, there is no support for focusing stories outside the Imperium. Like, the core war game is the only place where, like, you can play Eldar or you can play orcs, and oh sure, Rogue Trader lets you play as an orc, but you're working for the Imperium on an Imperium ship.
Yeah.
And I really have been craving a game ever that lets you do anything other than Imperium.
Man, I just want like an updated version of Gorka Morka.
We can't. Gorka Morka is too complicated to deviate from warp discussion for that long, but yeah.
Oh, yeah. Or just an updated version of the video game for the Dreamcast.
Oh, what's the name? So yeah, there's the interesting thing about the new one, which is what's it called? What one? If I can find it, someone else can feel free to continue. Oh, here, fine. Imperium Maledictum is the name of the new one that's coming out, and it's very much taking from Pulp Fiction roots and noir, and it uses the D100 system similar to Warhammer Fantasy 4th Edition.
I do like Warhammer Fantasy 4th Edition.
Yeah, so yeah, and then the different ones, the Wrath and Glory, which is again you could play just so much like anything, and tell like any story in it, which is kind of the goal of it. It uses a little bit more of a rules light system where it uses like I think it's a D6. It's a bit more similar to
Souls, yeah.
The one for Age of Sigmar.
Mm-hmm. Another fun game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think there's a bit of we're in almost like a resurgence of Warhammer games. I think it was just is in time with tabletop role-playing games kind of having such a surge in popularity these days.
And just now starting to branch out from D&D 5th Edition a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of...
Is there anything... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I want this channel to be part of that. Like, I want something that I pitch on this channel a lot to be, hey, if you're out there and you like D&D 5th Edition, look into other tabletop games, please. So many of them are so good. And them being good doesn't invalidate 5th Edition being good, because it still is. It's just there's lots of awesome games, and you can tell different stories. And I genuinely think if you get into tabletop role-playing games, being like, I just play 5th Edition, to me, is no less ridiculous than being like, yeah, I love anime. I've watched Dragon Ball Z 50 times, and I haven't touched anything else. Like, those are comparably ridiculous to me, because there's so many great games, and they all tell different kinds of stories.
Yeah, and if you are a fan of the mechanics as well, there's so many different vibes that other systems that can capture.
Mm-hmm. Like, so many people will post things on the D&D Reddit, like, how do I tell a post-apocalypse game in D&D? Or, how do I tell a high-flying fantasy adventure, or sci-fi adventure? Like, people will be asking things like that, and the answer really is just play a different game. Like, D&D tells heroic fantasy, and that's what it's there for. But, like, even if you wanted to play, like, high danger fantasy, I'd recommend using a different system. Like, Pathfinder 2 or Warhammer 4th Edition are both so well built for, like, a more dangerous form of fantasy where you have a higher chance of being killed. Pathfinder 2 being the one I'd use if what you want is a higher chance of losing. Warhammer 4E being the one I'd choose if you want something with a lower power level and a higher chance of permanent injury.
Yeah, it does actually embrace the ideas of being maimed as a character.
Yeah,
which is,
I think dying is easier in PF2. Being permanently injured is infinitely more easy in Warhammer 4th.
Definitely. Yeah, Sean, is there anything about the Immaterium that you want to talk about?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I don't really know what you guys have already talked about, so I don't really know what would be like.
Say what you want to talk about, and if we've already talked about that, we'll just call you a dumbass.
Okay. Fair enough. I guess, do you guys talk about like the concept of like Draknian and the first murder and all that?
Nope.
No.
Oh, so
you're not a dumbass. You're smart ass. You're smart as fuck, and we're ready.
Jeez. So the one thing I was just sort of wanted to get into when it came to 40K and the warp is that it really does work off of rule of drama.
Okay.
And so
That's true.
killing 100 people killing 100 strangers in open combat has nowhere near the same influence on the warp as a single cold-hearted murder of, say, like your brother.
Oh,
Because
okay.
they really do tell it as like the story of Cain and Abel. It's at least it's very similar too, and it
Okay.
is this feeling of betrayal that really is what powers the warp, and it also comes up a little bit in like fear to tread. I always mix it up with no fear. It's one of those two, because in the Horus Heresy, where it's just talks a lot about the power of betrayal and like the metaphysical power of the idea of betrayal and how that's reflected in the warp, and how it's not like there's this conversation between a word bearer and a ultramarine before the ultramarines are aware that the word bearers are termed, and this is a conversation between one of the few word bearers and ultramarines that actually get along. And it's this downright tragic scene where the word bearer is trying to explain to him that no, betrayal has power as long as it's personal. I'm not talking about the strategic value of betrayal. I'm not talking about like the cold, hard, pragmatic impact of betrayal and surprise. I'm saying that me right here turning on you would have power. And he's like really trying to get the Ultramarine to get this idea of that drama matters in the universe.
Which makes a lot of sense with it being a world of concept, because things that fit a narrative we give so much more conceptual weight to. Like
exactly.
Yeah, like the murder of Franz Ferdinand, I think, wouldn't feel as impactful if it weren't for the crazy, stupid way that it happened and how much it felt like fate was conspiring. I think like that gives it more weight historically. Like obviously it's very important because it was kicked off World War One, but World War One was probably going to happen anyways. But it's never going to feel like that because it happened dramatically in a weird coincidence. And drama matters. That's how we record history. So a world of concept would be shaped by drama.
Yeah, and if you look at it like we're speaking of humans, Xenos can end up being however they want according to how they're written. But like humans are intensely story-based creatures. We like stories, we listen to stories, we remember stories so much more than just hard facts. And so
exactly
the impact of drama is so much more meaningful than just a random occurrence. And especially if you think about it, like hearing about a war across the world, thousands of people dying, even more. That's not personally impactful to you. It doesn't like you can.
But a single anecdotal story from that conflict that might have killed thousands or hundreds of thousands is going to, this single story about like a single a mother seeing the death of their child. Yeah, that's going to have so much more weight to you.
And weight, like emotional weight, and like that, your connection to the warp in that way is very impactful.
And so just going back to what I actually want to talk about, like what I was originally trying to talk about, I mostly brought up the Caliph scene because that's one of my favorite scenes in the Horus Heresy because it's so well done. But Draknian is the echo of the first murder, and it's kind of implied that there had been plenty of killing and there had been war before, but Draknian is the first human-on-human, cold-hearted murder, and that's why it has such power.
Interesting.
And now it's stuck in Abaddon's sword.
The first murder lives in a sword.
Yeah.
How'd that happen? How'd it get in there?
What does that mean, lives in a sword? This is like the
sword, Draknian, is the echo of the first murder.
So, audience, do you remember how I mentioned that Eldar gods were just stories in a robot? This is why I wasn't lying there. The shit gets weird.
Yeah, so this is the story of the first murder compressed into a sword. I mean, I think it was Oculus Imperia, a YouTuber, who it's like, demons are stories that hate.
Yeah.
They are, because they are made up of stories in their own sort of way. And the power of the story is what gives the demon a lot of power. And, well, the power, not just the story, but also just the words. Like, the demons in the 40k warp really like the term demon because they are now defined by the powers and abilities that humans have ascribed to demons, which is to say a lot.
A box. Boxes are important.
Boxes are important. Yeah. Don't put a demon in a box.
I mean,
put a demon in a box. Put a demon in a box. I don't want that thing out of the box.
If you put something in a category, it solidifies it, though. You have an idea of it. You conceptualize it and thus give it like tangibility.
No, that does make sense.
And again, even if you look at like what we were talking about previously with the Legion of the Damned as effectively demons that are good.
They are of the Emperor.
Yeah, they're good. Their impact is always killing. Like, it is. They come in, they save the day by eliminating things. They're hateful in that way as well, I guess you'd say.
I mean, in a way, they are the story of the Adeptus Astartes. They are the concept of. They are how the masses see the Adeptus Astartes.
Yeah,
these unstoppable killing machines. The angels of death.
Angels.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. I like that idea a lot. I feel like because of how concept-based the warp is, are these creatures, are the reborn angels or demons, is kind of just solved that easy. That, like, well, technically we call everything, our word for everything that comes through is a demon, but these are angels because we say they're angels because that way they're angels.
Yeah. I mean, something that actually comes up in the Horus Heresy, which I found very funny, is that the Thousand Sons, when they were loyalist, so very psychically active legion, when they looked at the warp, they didn't see screaming faces. They saw a beautiful ocean, because that was their interpretation of, their cultural interpretation of the warp. And it kind of superimposed itself onto their perception, and kind of left them oddly blind to the corruption of the warp.
Interesting.
Because they came from a highly psychic culture that was very pro-psychic powers. And it talks about the primordial creator, that the warp is the sea of creation.
And that's something that I've talked about earlier, is that because the warp is based off of concept, you can only access the warp that you can conceive of, which is my theory and what I like about why, despite the fact that physical distance doesn't exist in the warp, things being further away makes it harder to travel to. That's just because the concept is further away. It is conceptually further. And the same would be true for if you see psychic energy as good, the warp that you have access to is one in which psychic energy is good.
And no matter what,
I mean,
there are limitations.
There are
then
limitations.
You have, Space Wolves who really do believe that they're pulling on the power of Fenris, not the warp.
Yep.
So they kind of are.
Yeah. Or at the very least, well, technically they're pulling on the warp. The part of the warp that they're pulling from is one that they've defined as Fenris.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's Fenris because it is. They are wild because it's like, well, magic is bad. How dare you magic Magnus? And Magnus just looks at them like, Bud, what? And they're like, well, no. This is runes. It's different. It's good.
It's the good stuff.
It's the good stuff.
You summon demons. You summon wolves.
You summon wolves that are ghosts. They're not demons.
So true.
Built different.
Why? Because they said they are, and that's how the warp works.
Yeah.
The warp is just a giant game of because I said so.
Kind of ends up being that way. I mean, look, it is. If you have really strong delusions, it can get you places, just not everywhere.
Yeah. I'm excited about the Tzeentch corner of this that I'm working on now because I get to get wild with the colors.
That is true. I think that it's probably some of my favorite colors. I think that the blues that Tzeentch often uses are really pretty.
Well, I'll also just say anyone who is watching this has seen my avatar, and easy to tell. I really like pink and blue together. I think they look awesome. And Tzeentch's pink and blue color scheme is super fun.
For sure.
And it's bird. Or
and
a
it's
mollusk.
bird, or mollusk, or tentacle, or eyeball floating in the sky.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Wait, Sean, do you want to talk a little bit more about Harlequins? I'm a little bit limited with my knowledge of them, and I kind of just gave a snapshot.
Let's see.
I talked about their guarding of the Black Library. The Black Library essentially having all information in the galaxy.
I talked about how if they are right that their god exists and can protect their souls from Slaanesh, every other elf is dumb for not joining them.
I mean, yeah. I mean, again, they're the servants of the one probably remaining Eldar god.
In which case, everyone should serve that god instead of living lives of obscene discipline that they can't convince any of their youth to follow, or lives of such debauchery everyone's bored of torture sex.
Look, not everyone can be a clown goblin.
Everyone could be, they could! Everybody could just fly their craft world in next to the Black Library and be like, well, we're committing to Trickster God now because it's an easier way of my soul not getting sippy cupped.
I mean, it is kind of implied that Sheol Gorok can't protect everyone's soul.
Oh.
It's like it is kind of he's swooping in to try to save their souls of his most devoted followers.
Damn.
It's a little bit like the Lilith in fantasy. Is that the goddess, the trickster goddess?
The trickster goddess, yeah, who ends up being revealed to be the
lady.
The lady.
The lady. But yeah, no, the Harlequins are one of the few groups that actually have a plan. Like up until recently.
I was describing them as like one of the only Eldari groups that actually make meaningful impacts in the setting.
It's because, again, they actually have a centralized command structure. They actually have a long-term plan, and they have the backing of a god.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they're pretty well put together, and they're also, clown goblins going around putting on cool shows.
Yeah. And the shows are stabbing.
Look, not necessarily.
Sometimes.
But frequently.
Often enough that it's worth making note of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find them like a really cool aesthetic. I really like the Harlequins.
Yeah, I agree. Honestly, I don't really know what else there is more to say on them that I know. Like,
I guess who outside of the Harlequins actually knows much about them? Because that was something I don't really know. I know that there are I think Gilliman knows a bit.
Yeah, at this point, Gilliman knows a decent bit and has they've actually interacted with a lot more Inquisitors than most Eldar groups.
That makes sense, but they're not going to be sharing that information. I feel like the militant wings, like things like the Navy, the Death Watch, Guardsmen, maybe not Guardsmen because it's harder for them to, because of how the raids happen, would know a decent amount about Drukhari in general, because it's like, yeah, we intercept them, we fight them, they are things we battle, but I feel like it just is powerful people who know anything of what the fuck is happening with the Harlequins.
Yeah, the Harlequins are again more willing to engage in diplomacy. It's hard to describe as diplomacy.
But there's so few people in the Imperium who are permitted to commit diplomacy that they would be very selective of who they interact with by necessity.
Yeah, so it really is Inquisitors, Gilliman, of course, other Eldar.
Feasibly a rogue trader. They're allowed to do diplomacy.
Yeah, there are definitely times when the Harlequins show up, save the day, and just sort of leave, and everyone's horrifically confused.
I mean, that's the thing Eldar do in general a lot, is show up, save the day, and leave. I mean, granted, I would say the Harlequins have a higher chance of showing up and helping and leaving, because the Eldar, it's really 50-50 if they're about to help or they're about to commit a real big genocide.
The same thing with the Harlequins. Well, I mean, again, it's they can see the future. They're playing the long game.
Yeah.
And they know that this Hive City has to fall and this Hive City has to stand. So they'll show up, help in one case, and show up and sabotage your reactor in the other. Because they think they have perfect knowledge of at least very solid knowledge of the future, but half the time they seem to get things wrong.
Didn't Gilliman managing to take off his suit make a bunch of the seers, future seers of the Eldar go, wait, what the fuck, are we wrong about seeing the future?
I don't know about that specifically, but
I've heard something about that. If you don't know about it, I could be wrong, but I think I remember something about that, of him being able to not be on the life support suit made people go, wait, what?
I know it really shocked Yvraine, because Yvraine was utterly convinced that it was basically the suit and her godly magic holding them together.
And it turns out built different.
I mean, Gilliman is built different.
I mean, all Primarchs are literally built different.
Yeah.
Oh wait, Sean, there's also... Is there a Primarch in the Black Library? I'm trying to remember what's going on.
Maybe. There's so much, about that. I've seen talks of, oh yeah, maybe Jagatai Khan is there, and, because he went into the Webway a long time ago. Maybe he ended up at the Black Library. Wouldn't that be neat? Ahriman is desperately trying to break into the Black Library and failing every time. Ahriman's not a Primarch, but, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if, one of the big reveals is Leman Russ and Jagatai have just been there having a debate for the past 10,000 years. It's been, 10 years for them. They popped out and were like, what the hell?
Wait.
I can see it. I can see that being how they bring back a Primarch.
Yeah.
There's a number of Primarchs that are not confirmed dead. They're kind of missing, Primarch of the Salamanders is maybe.
Probably alive.
I remember when I mean, he can't die. It's his whole deal. I remember when I was learning a bit about 40k, I ran into the Primarch that they talk about where it's like, we don't know what his deal is. No one knows what his power was. And I heard that and was like, there are absolutely fan theories that his power is stealth, and that's why no one knows about him.
I'm trying to think who that would be. Is that the... It's not the...
It's one... There's two Primarchs, I think, that nothing's known about, and one of them it's, we don't talk about him, and one of them is, nobody knows.
The Lost and the Damned, the Lost Primarchs. Okay, I thought you were talking about, like... Because I've seen people joke about the fact that Jagatai Khan is repeatedly mentioned as being forgettable, which is absurd, because he's a Primarch. He's a screaming Mongolian 8-foot-tall demigod. How do you forget
on a motorcycle.
On a motorcycle. Or a spaceship.
Look, he's gotta have his horse. The motorcycle.
No, it's a horse.
His title was literally Kaga.
Yeah.
They're just Mongolians. How do you forget about space Mongolians? That doesn't make any sense. So I've seen people joke, it's like maybe his secret power is that he's forgettable.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense to me. But no, I was talking about, like, I feel like there has to be fan theories that the Lost Primarch, his power is stealth, and he's actually around.
That's kind of funny.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, the reason for them not being mentioned, or like the Lost and the Damned existing, is because it allows people to make their own chapters with their own hypothetical Primarch.
Yeah. They're there for homebrew.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes sense, but I'm going to stick to my very fun fan theory that apparently doesn't exist. I felt certain it would. That their power is stealth, and that's why no one knows they're around still.
I mean, Corvus Corax's power was stealth, and Mortarian's power was arguably stealth.
Yeah, but there's a lot of crossover. A lot of them have the power of good at swords.
So true.
Yeah.
Wasn't there something... I remember there was like a fun holiday...
Try not to zoom out on this, but I do it sometimes.
There was a fun holiday thing where they talked about like the things that are most fitting for every Primarch, and they actually kind of gave a bit of a hint for...
Yeah. No, I remember that.
Yeah, I can't remember the...
That's such a weird way to give a hint about something.
It is. It was just like, hey, you want to be in line with your favorite, Legion, the original, like, first-generation Legion? Here's, like, our suggestions. And then, like, I think the only one that was redacted was the Damned one. Then the Lost actually had something, and I was like, what? Wait, what? Huh?
Look, that's what I'm telling you. He's around. His power is stealth.
Yeah, I kind of hope they do something with them in the future, because I don't think you need to have like your own Primarch as a homebrew, personally.
Yeah, I mean, I do like the theory that one of them was lost during the Rangden Xenocides, or maybe possessed, or like turned into a meat puppet.
Wouldn't it be scary and cool if there was a Primarch controlled by a Halo device, so that we have one who's turned by Xenos tech instead of by Chaos?
That could be fun. I also think that there could be like another existential threat. Because, look, the universe doesn't have enough existential threats.
It doesn't. We need more. These 4 guys right here that I'm drawing, not enough.
Mm-hmm.
And then we got the Tyranids, you got those boys.
Oh, God. Gotta have a day that we're talking about Tyranids at some point.
Yeah, I guess we can tie them in the briefest little bit, because like they are entirely like psychically active species.
And yet they don't travel with the warp.
They just blast themselves so fast with their living ships.
They do move faster than the speed of light.
In a way that I will describe as somehow.
In a way, it is probably some sort of psychic tech that's just not traveling through the warp.
I mean, it could just be how humans have conceptualized warp as possible in our universe, where they actually bend space-time around themselves.
Maybe using psychic powers.
Because people teleport with psychic powers, so you can bend space-time with psychic powers without going through the warp. So it could make sense for a species that evolved to be able to just create warp bubbles around themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But then you got to answer the question of why they can't time travel, and the answer is because.
The reason they can't time travel is because time travel is just breaks the setting every time they bring it up, and having it be a thing that having it be a thing that randomly happens during warp travel is, I think, the best they're going to get away with.
Yep.
It's also the most dramatically fun.
Yeah. I mean, okay, so, oh yeah, another thing about the warp is the idea of there is no time in the warp,
Yeah.
when I personally think there is time in the warp. It's just very distorted,
So-
but at the same time, it still kind of follows the same rules. There is still cause and effect. It's
I-
just bent.
I actually wanted to talk to you about this on here. I forgot. I really like my theory of time in the warp and think it works really well, which is that time doesn't exist in the warp, but because the warp is based off of concepts that we can access, we access a warp that relatively exists to the time that we understand, which is why there seems to be a grounding, like an anchor to time as we understand it, even though it's not time as we understand it.
Oh yeah, because like the Chaos Gods can reach back in time, but they can only reach back in time to a limited extent. Going further and further from there, conceptual time, conceptual real-world time becomes more and more difficult and seems to require more and more effort.
Yeah, because, like, you no longer are talking to people who have a concept of the future you're from, and you can only give, like, fragments of bits of information because they don't have a concept of that time. Like, it's what I like to explain why you can't just use the warp to instantly travel across the galaxy, because a concept of how far something is translates to a conceptual space. Same with time. And it's also why I think a lot of the story, or the famous story at least, and I think it's got to be more common, of time travel to warp is orcs, because they have a looser concept of things.
Makes sense.
I think understanding time less makes that more likely to happen.
Built different.
Built dumb.
You're right. One thing I always find funny, and this is like kind of tying into what Sean mentioned about the Chaos Gods having a limited power or like having a personification, because whether or not how much they are conscious entities that are an active actor versus kind of a passive actor, it depends on the lore. And there's some, like, one of the more recent books with Nurgle being in his little hut peeking out from his curtain is probably one of the funniest depictions
pretty
of
great.
Chaos Gods
What is that?
I've seen. So basically,
okay. Cool.
like, I'll explain like what I know, and then Sean can fill it in because I think it's really funny. Gilliman ended up getting taken into Nurgle's garden.
Okay.
By Mortarion.
By Mortarion, the Demon Primarch. And he got taken in, and then he got better because he's the golden boy, and he seems to believe more and more that he is the golden boy. He is the Emperor's chosen son.
I mean, he kind of got possessed by the Emperor.
Yeah, and so he basically got brought back from the like Nurgle's plague, the worst plague.
The Godblight, yeah.
Yeah, the Godblight that's supposed to kill a god, effectively. He got
Built
better.
different.
Yeah, so he gets better in Nurgle's garden, beats the shit out of Mortarion, and then Nurgle's in his little hut. He's got a little hut in Nurgle's garden.
Swamp hut.
Peeks in a swamp hut, like totally like Shrek style swamp hut. Peeks out from one of the curtains, and you see like the door open the littlest bit, and then kind of like pulls it. Was it Mortarion got pulled in?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mortarion basically gets like sucked in because like Nurgle's angry with him. And
Gramps was very disappointed.
Seeing it written, I would recommend trying to look it up because it is just such a funny scene to read.
It is fantastic, honestly. Like, Plague Wars was a really good series. Like, it's some of the best of the new stuff, in my opinion.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
So hearing about Nurgle's personification of being the old grandpa in the hut and swamp hut, and he just peeking from his little gross curtain. Get back in here, Grandpa's gonna lecture you.
You let me down, son.
It really is. That just Gilliman just starts ranting about how he's like the chosen boy. And he's gonna beat the shit out of Nurgle.
I love that. That's got to be a great way of getting past your daddy issues, is watching that happen to someone else with his new surrogate grandpa.
It's really good. Anything else you wanted to mention about that scene, Sean?
Nah, you covered it pretty well. It was a fantastic scene. Just Gilliman being like getting basically possessed by a god and being like, "Yeah, I'm gonna beat up the gods."
I'm gonna beat you up.
He really is like challenging Nurgle and other Chaos Gods personally, saying, "I will beat you up."
I don't care how much you represent ineffable concepts. I'll kick the shit out of you.
I mean, that's the Emperor, baby. I will beat this concept into the dirt through sheer violence.
Yeah.
You
The
mean
power
through
of
sheer
stubbornness
will?
and violence.
No.
No.
No. No.
You misunderstand. I will not conceptually beat up a concept.
I will physically beat up a concept.
Yeah, it's an interesting part of the new lore and new stories. I
Does
think.
my flaming sword look conceptual to you?
I mean,
so it's
that's
interesting
it.
to
Demons
personify
are
them.
demons are way more vulnerable to concepts than they are to physical actions.
Yeah.
Like
Mhm.
shooting a demon doesn't work nearly as well as a sword, stabbing it with a sword, because the sword has the concept of a killing edge to it, whereas a gun is a lot more colder, a lot less dramatic.
Oh, fuck. The Tau got no shot against demons.
Yeah, that is actually a big problem for them. Like,
They
a
have
lot
no
of their
depth
weapons-
perception. They can't use melee weapons.
I mean,
among other problems.
You got Commander Farsight with his Dawnblade.
I
It's
mean,
definitely not Demon Sword.
It's definitely not a demon sword. It just eats souls and puts the soul magic into them. It's not a demon sword. It's fine.
it's fine, guys. Stop overreacting.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I just really like the personification of them. I think it's interesting whenever there's talks about them having limited power or, like, you know, them struggling as a concept. Because it's not that it's wrong, it's just that I think it's a funny thing in the setting.
Yeah. I mean, my take is that they are sentient creatures, but they're sentient creatures that are almost like monomaniacally dedicated to their own increase in power.
Okay.
Like, what they are there for is to increase the concept that they are associated with. That is their sole drive, but they are fully sentient creatures capable of making sort of rational plans or even temporarily acting against their own instincts. Even if they are still solely driven by that one thing.
How much do you think they can learn?
I think
That's a
they can
good
only
question.
learn and grow as, like, they are thought... As like... I think learn information, yeah. As far as change, I think it only makes sense that they can change as, like, perspective of them changes. Because, to an extent, they are forged by belief.
Because they almost have sort of a counter... Like, they are changing people as people change them.
Yeah.
When you actually are operating on that sort of level of power. Like, Kugath has a lot of personality, the Plague Father. Particularly in 40k, where he's sad. He's very depressed because he was a Nurgling who ate Nurgle's favorite pox. And it made him a great unclean one.
Poor little guy.
And he has a lot of personality that has nothing to... Like, it doesn't really make sense for a great unclean one. Because he is an
Greater
individual.
Demons yeah, it seems like Greater Demons have more of a learning personality than the actual Chaos Gods do. The Chaos Gods are almost somewhere between a force of nature and a...
Like, they can
entity.
plan and react and think, but I think their, like, essence is still... And it makes sense that their little guys can grow, because the Chaos Gods are constantly being fed by emotion and thought and dedication. Like, they're constantly being built up by that, whereas demons are a piece of the Chaos God broken off and made separate. They were given power by the Chaos God, but they are not the Chaos God, and can now be an individual entity who's no longer being funneled in and shaped by belief.
Yeah, you can think of it like as how much that single those experiences can change individuals, because individuals are so small, but because these godly concepts are such a huge pool of conceptual force, actual change is difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So, trying to remember. Sean, what was the new Greater Demon that was recently introduced that you and I talked about with Tristan?
The Innovator one?
Yeah, remember his name?
I don't remember his name. I don't think he told me his name.
I think he did. It's a weird name. What's that called? It's not the Forge of Souls. It's the
Soul Forge?
the thing in the warp that's basically made, like, you know, the thing that makes all the chaos weapons and stuff. Is it also Forge of Souls?
That sounds like a thing it'd be called.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. So basically, there's a new Greater Demon. I'll kind of be looking him up while I talk about him, but he is technically undivided. Greater
An
Demon.
undivided Greater Demon, that's exciting.
Yeah, it's fairly rare, I'd say. And he is kind of separate from the 4 because
Shit, that's even more exciting. So he's not even a combination of all 4. He's just Chaos Undivided as an essence.
Yeah. So his deal is that he was made from the efforts of progress of technological innovation.
Ooh.
Kind of at all costs. The things that have mostly fed him was the creation, the rise of the Necrons as an entity, and people's reactions to it.
Yeah.
The cursed founding, which was of Space Marines, which happened because people were like, "What if we improve Space Marines?" And then it went terribly wrong. Except for like one of them, which is fine. But most of them either fell or are horribly problematic.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Primaris Marines are the third thing that have basically given power to this greater demon, and has created this greater demon. And so he is this entity which kind of aligns with, I guess you could argue, the Dark Mechanicum and other groups in the setting, where he is focused on progress, focused on innovation, and trying to do that. And he embodies this concept. Let me see if I can find his name. Do you remember in Fantasy, this would be in the newest DLC for Warhammer, or like Total War Warhammer? Do you remember the location you're trying to get to? It's like a forge. I can't remember.
I think it's the Forge of Souls.
Yeah, so he's a pretty cool greater demon. Because I think he's quite new. There's been a little bit of controversy about it because, like, it does somewhat give a argument for why the Imperium is, or like it validates the argument the Imperium has around being anti-innovation, because innovation has now created a great demon, which is very powerful.
That's kind of fun.
Yeah, so some people don't like it because it means that, like, oh, this like kind of very evil prosecution of progress, which seemed like it was inherently a bad thing, but it was due to past trauma that they actually continued this practice.
Mm-hmm.
It was valid because it has created this greater demon. So some people don't like it. I kind of like it. I think it's quite interesting.
Okay, so saying this, I get why people don't like it. A lot of what I find curious, as someone who very much doesn't like fascism to the point that it's a meme in our friend group, I kind of like that a lot of the concepts behind 40k are how fucked is a world need to be to have things that justify fascist rhetoric. So, like, being anti-progress and anti-modernity, I think in real life is generally bad, just as I think being, a zealot who rallies against debauchery generally is bad, because it's usually something used to persecute people. But 40k is a world where there is an essence of debauchery that is, it actually is fully corrupting and fully pure evil, and if you are not careful, it will consume your soul. And it's actually something that I find kind of interesting, that, like, it's a universe that justifies a lot of these views that in our world I don't like. And I get why people dislike that, but it is also what the setting's built on, so there being something that is actually a consequence of innovation, I don't hate, because that's kind of the universe of 40k.
I mean, I think I said this earlier, but part of the horror of 40k is that the Imperium is arguably right.
Mm-hmm. Like,
or at least justified.
Yeah. And that's scary. That is a frightening concept that I like about the setting. And I get why someone might not like certain ways that could be represented, but I don't especially have a problem with it.
I found his name. His name is Vashtor the Archithane.
Nice.
An enigmatic, demonic mechanic, a fiendish forge master who specializes in corrupt machines and insane innovation.
Okay.
Unsurprisingly, warpsmiths and the Dark Mechanicum think he's great, according to Warhammer blog post.
You know what? Makes some level of sense. They'd be down with him.
Yeah, so he's allied himself with Abaddon, trying to make the Arcs of Omen. Sean, do you know much about the Arcs of Omen?
Nope.
Alright, that's new lore that I'm also not familiar with that I'm reading right now. Yeah, so he's an interesting character. He is a Forge Master of the Forge of Souls, which is in the Warp, and it is kind of where they make all their profane weapons. Are the demon machine things that are in fantasy, are those also in 40k?
Yeah.
I feel like they would be from 40k and then retroactively brought in because of their policy that demons are always applicable from one to the other.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking as well. I can't remember what are they called again.
That's been my assumption, but I've never actually Soul Grinders. I've never actually looked into it.
Yeah, Soul Grinders are a thing in 40k.
Are they from 40k and then brought in after the fact?
I believe so.
Actually, wait, were Soul Grinders, or was it specifically yeah, I think Soul Grinders are as well. Yeah, because I'm mixing them up with the Defiler, but they
Soul
are different.
Grinders are, I think, a little older 40k. Let me see what the oldest reference is here. 4th edition, yeah.
All right. After this thought, I'm reaching the end, so we gotta come up with a good note to end this on, like something, one last thing to say, one last discussion point.
Well,
The human subconscious is a terrifying place.
Right. Is that the note? Is that the note we want?
I think that here, my take is that, like many things, in reality, very few things are good and evil, or good or evil rather. It is just a neutral thing that is given value based on what you ascribe it. And so the warp is the same, with it being a sea that is made up of thought, made up of emotion, made up of concept, and it is a force that is very powerful due to the immensity of the setting, how many individuals are present, but it can in times be of I think in good writing it can be used in really interesting ways. It can be used for good. I mean, you have the examples of Legion of the Damned, you have Saint Celestine and a lot of other individuals who are influenced by it, and I think that it's just a very unique concept that has been built, maybe from previous ideas, obviously, but I think it has become uniquely 40k.
I think that's a good take and a solid note.
Mm-hmm. What is your take on it, Lid? What was the final note for you?
I know, I pretty much agree with everything you said, and my final take for the warp is I think it's one of the coolest concepts to work with in 40k. I think it's really interesting, and I think everyone whose theories about why it works a certain way, why something doesn't work, how this place of concept without time or space could have certain rules, who has a different opinion than mine on why that's the case is wrong, because my theories are really good.
Simple as.
Simple as. Sean, final words?
Nah, I think I kind of summed it all up with the human subconscious is scary, and the idea of there being a constant feedback loop between an almost shared subconscious hive mind of humanity and individual humans is both awe-inspiring and absolutely terrifying, and yeah, it's like the whole idea of the noosphere.
Yeah.
Spooky.
All right.
Jungian.
So, we're going to close out, and I'm going to leave off by saying, everybody out there, like, comment, subscribe. That stuff's super important for a channel to take off, and this channel is going to take off. That is happening. And how it's going to be happening is that I'm giving a challenge to everybody out here who's watched this, who's liked watching the drawing happen. When you talk about the Drawk show, you're not going to say, yeah, I'm watching this new streamer, a new YouTuber, it's kind of a small channel, and act bashful about it. Fuck that. The mission I'm giving all of you is that you're going to talk about this as if it's already an established property. You're going to say, so I was watching the Drawk show. Leave it to them to ask. Leave it to them to Google. And pretending that we're already there is how we're going to get there shockingly fast. And do that because it would be funny if this channel explodes at a crazy pace that nobody could see coming. That's my pitch.
Baby.
And I need all of you to fake it with me. All right. Everybody have a good one. Remember to join the Discord if you want to be on the show and have a conversation with me and get some free art. And thank you guys so much for coming on and talking to me. It has been awesome getting to have a discussion and just talk about the warp, which is my favorite subject in 40k. And Eldar a little bit. Also talked about Eldar for a while while working on this art.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming on. Have a good one.
See you around.